was great hope after the collapse of communism that that Russia would come into the world community, and up to a point it began doing so, and then it all soured, and it did go wrong. Well, Putin himself changed. I mean, he became more and more influenced by Russian nationalism, which has always been a force there, more and more bitter about the fact he thought Russia had lost its place at the high table, wasn't being taken seriously, more and more paranoid about the West was encircling Russia with all its new members of NATO and all that. So it's sad, yeah. I mean, it's back to a difficult time, and we just have to hold our nerve.
Can you tell the last half a century of world history through one person? Well, at the Times you can. This is the one person. 50 years ago this week, Michael Binyon started reporting for the Times, and he's still here.
Yes, I am, amazingly, yes.
Michael, we'll do a sort of a romp through your career in a moment, but first of all, take us back 50 years ago. Where was the Times then? What was the Times office like? What was reporting like back in, 1972?
We were still in the place that we'd been since the Times was started, which was opposite Blackfriars Station, Printing House Square it was known. It was a new building, but it was the same location. It was then owned by Thomson Newspapers. It had William Rees-Mogg, who was my first editor, and it was a very gentlemanly outfit. In fact, so much so that every night you felt that you were jumping into a feather bed at the Times. It wasn't really very kind of competitive or cutthroat, or no, it took a much loftier view of the world.
Did that mean that it didn't necessarily go for scoops? It was a paper of record, it just reported what had gone on and let other people make trouble and that sort of thing?
Well, there was an attempt occasionally to get a scoop, yes, and people were quite surprised when there was a scoop, but we reported very much, yes, matters of record, and so stories went in because it was felt that we needed to record this, usually the right decisions, but sometimes there was no kind of urgency. I mean, there was a very pleasant, gentlemanly night editor who used to wear half-moon glasses and sit very calm late at night with his hands together, and he would say something, do you think our Washington correspondent is going to file the assassination of the president? Something of that sort. And I said, oh yes, undoubtedly he will.
Yeah. What about lunches, the pub? What role did all that play? Because, it's a very different world now.
Yes.
Tell me that there were legendary lunches.
Well, there were for the other lesser fry. I mean, the Express and the Mail and, the Sketch. I don't think the Sun was around then. They all went to Elvino's in Fleet Street. We were just along, not in Fleet Street, but all those papers that were there all went for the legendary lunches. Times a little bit distant from that. There wasn't quite the sort of drinking culture. There was beer served in the canteen on the top floor, which you don't get now. And so there was quite a lot of sort of rowdiness at about 9 in the evening when editions were going to press. But there wasn't much of a drinking culture then. No, it was just generally a bit more gentlemanly.
So let's start then with your career with the Times. You graduated as a student of Arabic, and then you ended up being based in Cairo.
Yeah, well, no, not straight away. No,
Right.
I was meant to go to the Middle East for a year to practice my Arabic at university, but it was 1967, and the Six-Day War had meant there were riots, anti-British riots, and I was going to Iraq, and they burnt the British consul to the ground. So they said, sorry, no job there. There's another place going, Soviet Union. So I said, oh, well, why not? So I spent a year in the Soviet Union, in, of all cities, Minsk, which was pretty dull in those days. So a year in Minsk, and then I came back in '68, and somebody said, well, I didn't know what to do, Foreign Office possibly, journalism, teaching, I had no idea. And somebody said, there's a job going on the Times Education Supplement. So I applied there, which in those days was much closer to the main paper. I mean, we were just behind the main building. So I got a job there and did 2 years there, which was sort of baptism of fire of how to be a journalist when you're 22 or whatever, and that was good fun. And then I went for a year to BBC Arabic service, and then I came back with a higher education supplement for a year, and then I joined the main paper, which is where I start the date. Yeah. Joined the main paper on the night news desk, 1972 in October.
So then but was it then the Times that sent you to Cairo?
Yes, well, yeah. That was only a year later. It was, indeed. That was the Middle East 73 war. And I started off in Jordan, and absolutely nothing was happening then because Jordan didn't take part in that war. So we were thinking, well, let's get to the action. So we took an incredibly long flight all the way Baghdad, Turkey, Cyprus into Lebanon. I mean, it took 4 hours. It's usually a half-hour flight. And then from there, I got a plane to Libya because, of course, Cairo airport was shut. And from Libya, I got a taxi across the desert, stopping in the morning at El Alamein for breakfast, and then on to Egypt, down to Cairo, and then 3 weeks in Egypt reporting the Middle East war. By then, there was a ceasefire. I crossed into the desert over the pontoon bridge, over the canal. Luckily, the Israelis weren't bombing anymore at that time, but all kinds of chaos was going on in the desert.
And how do you report? I mean, these days you take a phone and you could email your copy back. How do you get your reporting out of Cairo in 1973?
Well, the standby for every journalist in those days was the telex, and everybody became an expert in punching this tape. You made the tape with little holes in it, and made your tape, and then you fed it into the machine. You go chug, 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 and it would come through. But of course, there was such incredible pressure on the few telex lines available that we basically had to beg Reuters, and we went along to Reuters, took our copy with us, and they said, we'll send it as soon as we can, which usually meant a wait of about 5 hours. So it wasn't instant copy. No, phones were impossible. No mobile phones, of course, in those days. I tried to book a landline phone. I thought I'd just tell my wife where I was. So I tried to book a call home. They said, no, sorry, it's a 9-day wait for the phone. And I forgot all about it. In the middle of the night, 9 days later, suddenly you're called to London about 3 in the morning.
And what impact did that have on what was then appearing in the paper? Was there a lag?
There was a bit, yes. I mean, one tried to file as early as possible. We had the advantage of 2 hours ahead of London. And of course, as a journalist traveling around the world, you always had to remember what is London time and what is your time. If you're ahead of London, it's easy. You've got a bit of time in hand. When you're in Washington, it's a nightmare. You're 5 hours behind. You've got to really get early, get it done, and get it for the first edition.
And is that where you got a taste of being a foreign reporter?
Yes, I think that was it was very exciting, and it was a war. It was then a big diplomatic thing when Kissinger came along after a break in relations, and we had the fantastic kind of, suddenly Kissinger in Egypt were the best of friends, and Sadat announced that there would be a ceasefire, and the shuttle diplomacy started and all that. And I stayed on for about 2 or 3 weeks, sort of mopping up the war, as it were. Then back to the foreign desk, and then the job came up in Washington, seconded back to the 2 education supplements. So I did 2 years there, and then they said, would you like to reopen the Moscow job? Because we'd had a Moscow correspondent, but he was rather friendly with the dissidents, and the Russians didn't like that. And 5 years earlier, they just kicked him out. That was it, he'd expelled. So the office was shut, the bureau was shut, we lost the flat, we lost everything. And I had to go out there, starting off in a very dreary hotel for about 4 months, and reopen the office. But that was fun, that was interesting, and it was the dozy days of Brezhnev, I mean, proper communism, and it was a wonderful chance to just report daily life in Russia, because the one thing people didn't know is, what do Russians do? How do they live? They couldn't travel. Nobody had ever met Russians before. We just knew about them from our kind of cartoon characters, as it were, the baddies. But just talking about how they cope with winter, how they go into the pet market, what it's like traveling on a Russian train, those sort of things. That was a lot of fun, and I did a weekly diary of Moscow life for about 4 years. Yeah.
How much of that, because it's interesting that about foreign correspondence, and how much of it is the sort of the big bang global diplomacy and the superpowers, and how much time do you spend sort of just reporting on the day-to-day life, the sort of man on the ground type reporting?
Well, it's a bit of both. You are the only correspondent usually in that country, so you have to cover everything. So whatever's important. So if economics, big power diplomacy, day-to-day life, even sport, about which I knew very little. I mean, some big match with Moscow Dynamo or something, they wanted some coverage. You have to do everything. So you wake up in the morning, think, now, what shall I do with my empire today? What shall I tell the world about Russia or life in the Soviet Union? And then if there's an obvious thing, if there's a big summit meeting or something like that, everyone knows that's the focus. Or some extraordinary thing happens, or if it's a dull day, you look for a funny story, some amusing thing, some slice of life kind of thing. You try to vary it so that over the course of a month, you've given people a taste of what life is like in your patch, whether it's Moscow or the Middle East or wherever it is.
And does being the Times man in Moscow open doors? Did you get to meet some of the key? I mean, clearly, in terms of global politics, what was happening in Russia in the 1980s was a big deal.
Yeah, it very much was. I mean, they thought that the Times was the same as Pravda. They thought it was the official government newspaper, and therefore it was the one that mattered. And I never told them, actually, it's not quite a government newspaper, but it opened quite a few doors. So the Times was always considered the paper of record, and if they wanted something, they would make sure I was invited to. They didn't often give press conferences, not in Soviet times. They started during the Moscow Olympics, which was a lot of fun. And they started thinking, well, we better get this horde of foreign correspondents are wanting stories. So they started giving press conferences. But things like the invasion of Afghanistan in 1979, you couldn't just go and ring people up and say, what's going on? But what they did do, they made available some pretty well-connected, very senior figure, probably a senior commentator on a newspaper, who would agree to maybe come for lunch with 5 or 6 selected correspondents, so the Times and the BBC and 1 or 2 others that were seen as the sort of voice, and you would get access that way.
And is there a challenge for you clearly you were worried about your safety and how much you could report without upsetting essentially your hosts and your sources of information?
Yes, I mean, I think you must be brave. You can't say, I won't do anything that upsets the host, because then the Russians think we've got another holy fool here, another useful idiot.
Yeah.
And obviously they were expecting that you would cover things like the trials of the dissidents or the, obviously Afghanistan, the invasion of Afghanistan, and they would expect you to be pretty critical. But the key thing was to keep a balance. So what you sent to London was a bit of the really tough stuff they didn't like, but equally, if you wrote about how Russians enjoy themselves on holidays or something like that, which people found interesting, that's a fair journalistic story, but the Russians were quite happy that you were reporting that. So as long as you kept a balance, and occasionally, I mean, the KGB would check on you. You could, you knew the flat was bugged, and they would sometimes follow the car, but never too obviously. So I never had any real trouble. I never got denounced in the papers, which is the first sign that they're not happy. Or get your car tires slashed. That's another sign that they're not very happy.
And you later on, you interviewed Gorbachev amongst others.
Yeah, and not while he was in office actually. And I had left the paper when Brezhnev was still there, so I missed the collapse of communism. But I went back several times, having been 5 years nearly in Moscow. Whenever our Moscow guy was on holiday, I would go back for a stint. So I'd go back for, say, 3 weeks or sometimes a month. And so I did go back several times when Gorbachev was already there. And it was just startling, the change in atmosphere. I mean, suddenly people were free to speak about all kinds of things. I mean, historical taboos, what happened to the Tsar, what about the revolution, what about Stalin's purges? We could talk about all that with Russians, which previously they'd never really been allowed. It was all, out of bounds. But I interviewed Gorbachev, after he'd left office. It wasn't a sensational interview. He did talk an awful lot. I mean, he did have a tendency to waffle on. He was very keen on his new role in starting the Green Cross, which was sort of environmental equivalent of the Red Cross. Sadly, it didn't really get very far, but he wanted to tell me all about that. And he was very affable and pleasant. Living in Russia when Gorbachev was in power, I mean, the intellectuals thought it was wonderful. Suddenly we could talk about anything. And ordinary people thought it was dreadful. There was nothing to eat and no food. I mean, the economy was going down the drain, and Gorby had no answer to that at all.
Yeah, good news for the intellectuals, bad news for everyone else. And then still in the 1980s, you went from Moscow to Germany.
Yes. Well, that was quite a lively time. It was Bonn, of course, because it was West Germany.
Yeah.
And Bonn is a very small city. I remember an American correspondent from the Chicago Tribune, I think it was, he said, Bonn is half the size of a Chicago graveyard and twice as dead. It was a small city in Germany. But it was a lively time because Helmut Kohl had just come into power with the Christian Democrats, and the Greens, for the first time, were in Parliament. And the Greens were the big wave of the future, the whole kind of environmental thing. I mean, it really got going in Germany. And there was plenty to report. I went across to East Germany once or twice. I mean, the whole business of crossing Checkpoint Charlie over into East Berlin, then into East Germany. It was quite a rigmarole. And so years later, when I reported the fall of the Berlin Wall, I thought, I knew what it was like. I knew what it was like crossing over.
Just describe that, the fall of the Berlin Wall. Where were you? Was that when you were still reporting?
I was still reporting, but after Germany, I went to Washington as bureau chief. Yeah. Then I went to Brussels, and I was in Brussels, and we had a correspondent, Anne McElvoy, in East Berlin, but it was impossible to cross from East to West Berlin. And when the wall came down, everybody tried to cross. So they needed somebody in West Berlin as well. So I was pretty close. They said, how quick can you get to West Berlin? It's only about an hour and a half's flight. I said I could be there by 7:30 tomorrow morning. And I got to the airport and I just said, the wall, straight away to the taxi driver, drove me to the wall. And there I saw people just dancing on top of the wall. I thought, this is just unbelievable, having known what it was like. And they said, come, and come up. It's quite high. The wall is quite much higher than you sort of think. And so with difficulty, I scrambled up. They were pulling me up to get up on top of the wall. I lost my house keys in the process. Never found them again. I remember that. And I stood on top of the wall and looking across into the East Berlin with the Stasi guards with their guns, just not knowing what to do, just standing around, no orders, and all the West Berliners dancing on top of the wall, screaming and shouting. It was very exciting.
Were you surprised by the speed with which it happened?
Yes.
This thing that had been there for such a long time suddenly wasn't?
Yes, nobody expected that at all. And when they opened the barrier and the East Germans came flooding across into West Berlin, it was very funny because it was actually in the British sector. So they came across, and the British, who were nominally in charge of that part of Berlin, although obviously it was not, Britain didn't run it, but the army set up a welcome point, which was a pretty grubby old tent with a sort of trestle board table outside and urns of tea. Well, the East Germans didn't care us. They went straight past it. They were trying to say, welcome to the West. Went straight past it to the main supermarket where they went to buy bananas and luxury goods and whatever they could find.
They didn't want Britain's tea.
Oh, good Lord. No. I don't think a single person stopped. And they said, and the British were saying, hello, well, willkommen. They were saying, willkommen. Nobody took any notice at all.
Let's rewind a bit. Let's go back to when you were in reporting from Bonn to begin with. And you were involved in what was potentially the biggest story the Times had ever broken.
Yes.
With the small caveat that it turned out not to be true.
It wasn't true. I remember the story very well, the Hitler Diaries. I was the Bonn correspondent, and as it later turned out, we didn't know then, but some fraudster had sold these diaries that he claimed were the originals to Stern magazine, which was the big news magazine in Germany. And they, in turn, had tried to sell it on to Rupert Murdoch and also to Newsweek. And they were trying to play one off against the other. And so Murdoch very smartly said, look, they're trying to outbid us. Let's get together and let's go there jointly. And I was summoned to meet them in Hamburg and together meet the Stern people. And they invited the editor over, the Times editor, New York Post over, all the top brass from Murdoch's empire. And we met these Stern people. Rupert Murdoch did the negotiating himself, alone to start with. He offered 2.5 million, I think, for the global rights. It went on all day, and we tried to get the lawyers to get a guarantee that these things were true, and we had no guarantee at all. Everyone's pretty skeptical about it, but we thought, well, it's a sensational story if these diaries really are there, and what do they say, etc. By the end of the day, Stern said, so we are agreed on 2.75 million. And Rupert Murdoch said, no, we're not agreed on that. That was not the price. Sorry, I'm going home. And he left, got up, walked out, and that was it. And they realized they'd missed a trick. The whole thing was off. And we sort of breathed a sigh of relief. But then, 3 weeks later, they came to New York. They did another deal separately with Murdoch for, I think, about 275,000. Absolutely nothing.
Yeah.
And it was on again. And we were told that the diaries were going to be published that Saturday. So I happened to be in Britain, and I was summoned to the Times. Quick, come up, write the splash, So I remember writing that something like the secret diaries of Adolf Hitler have been found in an East German hayloft. And Charlie Wilson, who was then deputy editor, was there, and so was Peter Hennessy, who was then on the staff, now Lord Hennessy. And he said, I would be careful because I mistakenly identified one of the Cambridge spies, the wrong one. I would put alleged. So I put the alleged secret diaries of Adolf Hitler. Charlie Wilson came along and said, we've paid for these, they're not alleged. Took out the alleged. And then a week later, it all collapsed.
What was it? Because it's a fascinating. It's such an extraordinary thing, and I can see how the excitement about having such an amazing scoop might gain a sense of momentum. These are Hitler's diaries from the bunker.
Yeah.
What was it that meant that they collapsed a week after the story was published rather than the week before?
I mean, the West German government was absolutely, totally embarrassed. I mean, it's the last thing they wanted to know. And so Stern, they challenged Stern, show us the proof. Show us what you have as proof. So they said, well, all right, give us the actual document. We will test the paper and the ink, and we will do all that sort of, which they hadn't done.
Yeah.
And within 4 days, they came back, said, it's a crude forgery from the 1980s. And that was it. And then all hell broke loose. And I mean, Stern, they were, I mean, basically the magazine was finished. I mean, it recovered, but it was ruined.
Yeah.
A year later, when everyone had forgotten all this, the forger, a guy called Kuyau, was put on trial for, I mean, they found all sorts of charges against him, put on trial in Hamburg. Nobody paid any attention. And I thought it would be interesting to see what I went up there, and it was very relaxed. And in the break between the as the trial was going on, he was allowed to go out into the corridor and have a smoke. So I got hold of him, caught him and said, Herr Kuyau, the Times was very involved in this story. You know, I'm very interested about this. He said, oh, you should have come to me. I would have written some specially for you.
Done your own. That's about. I mean, I suppose in a long history, any newspaper which has been around for as long as the Times will sometimes get things wrong.
Yes, they will. Well, of course, there were fake diaries from Mussolini's son-in-law that had come earlier. I don't think the Times got involved in that, but it should have been a bit of a warning. Be careful.
Let's move on to Washington then. You left all the real security threats and complex world of Berlin and Moscow. You go to Washington. One of the biggest challenges there, obviously, is the time difference.
Yeah, the time difference. And funnily enough, the other challenge is that the Americans are not really very interested in talking to foreign correspondents.
That's interesting.
All that matters for the presidency, is the New York Times, the Washington Post, AP, UPI, the domestic agencies, the St. Louis Dispatch, all the other ones, Boston Globe, the Times of London. Oh yeah, well we might fit them in, and they sometimes said, I tell you, why don't we knock off all the Europeans together? And you knew that there was a message for Europe if you suddenly got an invitation to meet Senator so-and-so, and then you'd find your colleague from Le Monde or La Stampa or Frankfurt Allgemeine were there as well. I got a chance at very short notice to interview Reagan, and that was because he wanted to send a message to Europe about being tough on Libya. They were having, it was just bombed Libya. There was some big campaign going on. So we were summoned to the White House, again, the four of us, France, Germany, Italy, and myself. And Reagan was absolutely charming. He'd been well briefed. We were only allowed to ask about this one issue. Been well briefed, so he answered the questions pretty well. And then he came over, was very nice and really charming. How long have you been in Washington? Do you have a nice time? And suddenly I understood why it was that this guy had such a grip on the country. He just played the role with great charm. And the moment I left the Oval Office, within 5 minutes, he probably had no idea who I was.
But it had an impact on you.
Yeah, it was good. I mean, it was a good interview. And then, of course, there were all the Reagan-Gorbachev summits, and that was interesting. And again, the time difference, I mean, the worst one of all was the Reykjavik summit in Iceland, because again, we were 2 hours behind London. So the deadline for the first edition was 7:30. The summit finished. We didn't know whether it was a failure or a success. It all depended on whether they'd agreed on an arms control deal. We didn't know. And along comes Schultz, the American Secretary of State. There was a briefing room for the Americans. I was in with the American correspondents. We had a phone line back to our office in Washington, just one phone line, but straight back. Couldn't get contact London or anywhere. And it was absolutely on deadline. I told them, keep the paper, hold the front page, wait for it. Schultz came in, he said, a world without nuclear weapons, a summit that ends on a smile and a handshake. At last, after 6 decades of hostility, a chance for peace. So I phoned the Washington, quick, Schultz says, summit ends, smile and handshake, world without nuclear weapons. Then after about 5 minutes rambling on, he said, unfortunately, it was not to be. He said, unfortunately, we didn't agree on anything, and I'm afraid the summit collapsed. I called Washington, said, stop, tell it. I said, sorry, we sent it already. And that was it. The first edition had summit ends, smile and handshake, a world without nuclear weapons. And, 5 minutes. I said, just 5 minutes couldn't. It had gone. Too late. Second edition was very different.
We've all been there with how the second edition could look very different to the first. And then you became in the end of the 80s, early 90s. You were then in Brussels.
Yeah,
you've really ticked off all the big jobs.
Yeah, well, Brussels, I have to say, was probably one of the liveliest times to be in Brussels. It had just came after Thatcher had denounced the identikit Europeans. She'd had this great speech in Bruges where she'd been suddenly said that we don't want to be part of this great political union, and she started waving her handbag around and getting very upset. And it was also the time when the Europeans were getting very ambitious. Jacques Delors was the president of the Commission, very ambitious, very powerful. He came up with a plan for monetary union. And of course that, again, the British were very confused as to whether they wanted it or not. I remember Nigel Lawson came and gave a press conference, said, "This will lead straight away to the United States of Europe, and Britain wants no part of that." So straight away we knew where we were.
Yeah.
But then, of course, 1989, there was also the collapse of all of Eastern Europe. So I was in sort of pole position to report on what was going on in Hungary, Romania, Czechoslovakia, all these other places where things were collapsing. So that was a lively time. I just did 2 years there, but I happened to go to the summit in Paris, representing the Times, where Thatcher made her final appearance the day before she lost power. And she was in the British embassy. She heard that she had not won the vote. She had to go to a second round.
She hadn't got enough to beat.
She hadn't got enough to win decisively. I got a ticket, the only one the British press got, to the banquet at Versailles. So I was there already in the little auditorium where the ballet was going on when she came in, and you could see all the others below. They'd heard the news, and they knew one of their own was wounded. They realized she was in, and suddenly, having lambasted her throughout all the EU summits, they were very gallant. They got up, the Spaniard kissed her hand, Helmut Kohl showed her to her seat. She was a model of self-control, smiling, how charming, how lovely. And the ballet started, and the ballet was dreadful. I mean, they were like a herd of elephants. They were young, they were kids. I saw the Gorbachevs whispering. I thought they were saying, "Better in Moscow." But Thatcher was just looking straight ahead like that. And I could see she wasn't seeing anything. She was thinking, what do I do tomorrow? She flew back first thing next morning, summoned all her cabinet, and that was when it all collapsed. They didn't back her. So I saw her the night before it all collapsed.
And then you came back to London to become diplomatic editor.
Yeah.
What does that role involve?
Well, quite a lot of travelling with the foreign secretaries. So I travelled a lot with Douglas Hurd, and then Malcolm Rifkind, and then Robin Cook. Lots of quick trips, a couple of days to the Middle East, and you knock off about 4 countries in 2 days. I went out to various places. I did a few kind of ones on my own, going out to some summits, a lot of summitry, all the EU summits, all the G7 summits as well, lots of those. They were good fun.
Even in my limited experience of doing summits, you don't see much of the country. You see a lot of the airport waiting lounge and the inside of windowless
Well, you
rooms.
get the sort of press tent.
Yes.
And occasionally they come and brief you. And the best summit of all was EU summit in Lyon. Lyon was the gastronomic capital of France. And Paul Bocuse, the most famous French chef, decided to put on a feast for the press. My goodness, that was, I don't know how we ever managed to write anything after that. It was delicious food. And we saw, the leaders came and went and did some briefing, and I can't even remember what the issues were. But yeah.
You can remember the food.
I remember the food was wonderful.
And what being up close with foreign secretaries over that period of time, were there any particular you got on with, who you found to be very open or useful for the job of
they were all very friendly. Yes, Douglas Hurd was very friendly. He was pretty disciplined. I mean, if you were late, he just left you behind. That was it. Nobody waited. Even he left his own diplomats behind if they weren't there on time for the plane. Malcolm Rifkind was very friendly. He'd come and chat. And so I remember flying to, I think we went to Ukraine. I went with him. We flew over Belarus. And he was sort of wondering about Belarus. He said, I've always wondered, is this a real country? Not a bad observation, actually. And yeah, they would brief you on background, and you could very often attend the first 2 or 3 minutes of their meetings, and then the press where they took photographs, and then you all left. And we went to some places. We went to Albania, I remember, soon after the collapse of communism, and to my amazement, the airport was cobbled. So landing was pretty horrific. So the plane was...
Well, the runway was cobbled.
The runway was cobbled.
Wow.
Yeah, it really was. A German plane came in just after us and burst all its tyres.
Wow.
Didn't help. Yeah, it was a very odd place. And there was a lot of travelling around, and then a lot of Foreign Office briefings, the London end of the big stories. So obviously Iraq was the big story then, the first Gulf War, 1990, I think, and then also the second Gulf War. I was doing that from the London end. So there was a lot of briefing about how Britain saw it and what was going on.
And did you, having been at that point, you'd been doing the job, in different parts of the world for a long time, did you start to find that actually you knew more about these issues, or you had more memory of all these things than some of the people you were dealing with? Because a foreign secretary, they were health secretary 1 minute, and now suddenly they're foreign secretary.
That's right.
You've been thinking about these places for years.
I mean, I didn't have more knowledge of what was happening then, but I had probably better historical knowledge and better background knowledge.
Yeah.
For example, the invasion of Cyprus in 1974, I was on the foreign news desk. I remember it very clearly. I remember negotiating, is our correspondent safe and all that. So when we travelled to Turkey about 25 years later, and I said, did you know that the Prime Minister, who I think he came back in power, or had been, Bülent Ecevit, I said, did you know he translated T.S. Eliot into Turkish? And he was the Prime Minister at the time of the invasion of Cyprus. And people said, did he really? I don't remember that. So you had sort of little snippets of information that you knew from previous experience. And that was always useful. But the thing about being a long time on a newspaper, you do have historic memory, but you're no good if you can't remember what happened yesterday. If you're writing an editorial, for example, it's no good saying, well, back in the 1970s or the 1990s. You have to know last week. That's what you've got to keep up with.
Well, then we move into the early noughties, and you became a leader writer. Suddenly not writing on your own name, but putting forward the paper's position.
That's right.
Explain to people who don't know how that works. Talk us through the process of one of those editorials appearing.
Well, the editorial nominally is the editor's view. It's the view of the paper, but that means it's the view of the editor. So it's the only bit of the paper where the editor has the right to change what you've written if he doesn't agree or doesn't like it. But we try to make sure that everybody is on the same wavelength. So we have an editorial meeting in the morning where we go through the list of what the news is, and we pick 3 subjects. We have a top leader, a middle one, and a bottom one. We call them leaders, editorials. Leading article, we call it, a leader. So we pick 3, and obviously the top one is the main issue of the day, or whatever we think we ought to talk about. And so we check, what it might be. For example, supposing it's obviously yesterday, it would be Ukraine, the blowing up of the bridge. So we would have a discussion about what does this do for Putin? What should we say? Should we concentrate on what's going on in Russia now? And I said, well, actually, I wrote an editorial on that only 3 days ago. So let's look at the nuclear threat, the threat to use, how serious is that? What should the rest do? So there's a discussion. And the editor will either put in his point of view, or you write it according to what is the sort of general brief. And occasionally the editor will disagree after that. Not often. It's a bit annoying when they, change what you've written. And occasionally you don't agree with what the editor thinks. And then it really is more difficult because, you could just say, well, I can't write that, I don't agree at all. And then, frankly, you're not much good on the team. So sometimes you slightly have to write things a little bit through gritted teeth, but you put the best spin on it that you can.
And what for you is the purpose of the leader? Is it just to sort of set out a point? Is it to guide the reader into trying to make sense of the world? Or is it to sort of, and maybe there have been moments when it sort of changed the world, changed opinion?
Yes. Well, it's to guide our readers especially, and to some extent, we a bit perhaps pompously, we think it might influence government policy, particularly on some things. If the Times is really thundering about the 45 pence income tax, which we did. We said it's absolutely wrong. And this is from a paper that has supported the government on quite a number of things. I won't say we always support the government. We're not always pro-conservative at all. But that criticism, I think, was just one of several. But the fact the Times was strongly against it meant that the government, among other things, listened to public opinion. We are trying to form public opinion. We're trying to lead how public opinion should look at all sorts of things. It could be medical ethics, it could be the question of euthanasia or something like that. It could be on any subject. We are part of the public opinion forming process.
And then coming into the sort of the 2010s and more recent times, have you been surprised? There was the whole thing about, the end of history, this sort of benign time they were all supposedly living through. And actually what we've seen in the last few years, most notably in Ukraine, but in other parts of the world as well, that maybe we got all that wrong. That actually the world is as full of turmoil as probably at any point in your career.
Well, indeed, yes. I mean, the thing is that one always has to look at the history of a country. And the history of Russia has never been a history of democracy, ever. I mean, there's been a history of chaos, which was called democracy under Yeltsin, but frankly, just chaos. It's like an inoculation against democracy for the Russians. Just, people rampaging around on the street, no law and order at all. So you do have to understand where a country's coming from and what national attitudes are. And you have to understand how our country should work with or understand national attitudes. Now, there was hope that things were leading towards a smoother, calmer relationship. There was great hope after the collapse of communism that that Russia would come into the world community, and up to a point it began doing so, and then it all soured, and it did go wrong. Well, Putin himself changed. I mean, he became more and more influenced by Russian nationalism, which has always been a force there. More and more bitter about the fact he thought Russia had lost its place at the high table, wasn't being taken seriously. More and more paranoid about the West was encircling Russia with all its new members of NATO and all that. So it's sad, yeah. I mean, it's back to a difficult time, and we just have to hold our nerve.
When I was looking back through all of the people you've interviewed over the years, all the places you've been at, I hope it takes in the nicest possible way. It sort of reminded me of Forrest Gump. You've been at all of the, to have been, in the Oval Office with Ronald Reagan, at the fall of Thatcher, at the fall of the Berlin Wall. Did it feel like that at the time? Do you feel like you've had a front row seat in some of these great moments in history?
Well, certainly two of them, fall of Thatcher and fall of the Berlin Wall. I felt at the time, wow, this is history happening all around me. I really thought this is history. In the desert with the Egyptian forces, when the peace deal was signed at Kilometre 101 in Cairo, I also thought, gosh, that's the end of this war. I'm witnessing them signing it. And you did feel a sort of responsibility to report it well and properly and in as vivid a way as you can. Some things you just think this is a bit of a laugh, although you're just doing the daily story. But yes, meeting these various statesmen and people, it is an honour. They're not always very pleasant or lovely, but mostly they're quite friendly. I mean, if you've got the chance of an interview, it means they're ready to be interviewed. So they're usually reasonably agreeable, and that is interesting. I mean, King Hussein was absolutely charming, and King Abdullah, his son, I've interviewed both of them. King Abdullah I've interviewed quite a lot. President Assad was really charming. That was when he was a good boy, and that was when he was just before he came to see Tony Blair in London. And his wife, English-born, English-speaking wife, very charming also. And it's all gone horribly wrong there also.
Is there anyone you'd like to have interviewed in the last 50 years?
Oh, gosh. Yes, I suppose. I mean, I won't say interviewed, but I've met Putin 3 times. I've asked him a question, but along with several others. And that was interesting. I've never met a French leader, or I did interview Helmut Kohl. I've not interviewed any other American president apart from Reagan. Others get their chance. Yeah. It just happens where you are. I mean, you can't do all of them yourself. That would be nice, but you can't.